All right, so we are moving along here through Arthur Young's book, The Reflexive Universe. And now, let's see, let's take a look at the grid so we know where we're at so far here. Let's bring up his grid. And so here's what it looks like. And so we've already gone over light. At the top left there, we've gone over light and nuclear subatomic particles, which he does not. He's at least self-effacing enough, I would say, to not try to shove, like let's say Ken Wilber would do, to try to shove something into his grid that doesn't belong there and won't fit. So instead of being that kind of a jerk, he just admits, I can't make subatomic particles fit, so he leaves it blank. So then we discussed atoms, which represent the principle of identity. So light, each one of these kingdoms has its own principle. Light is potential because it's the basic purposiveness of everything. Nuclear is binding or the creation of substance. Now things are being bonded together. Subatomic particles are coming in, protons and electrons. Binding is occurring now. And then at the atomic level, we have the periodic table of elements, which we analyzed last time, which have to do with the formation of identities for each one of those elements, those atoms. Now we're at the molecular level here, which is the principle of combination. So we'll take a look at that in a second. And then we'll be moving to the vegetable world, which is the principle of growth, the animal world, which is the principle of mobility, and the human world, which is the principle of dominion. But as these rows go across horizontally, they recapitulate the same structure, as we'll see here. So with molecules then, what corresponds to the kingdom of potential are the metals. Then salts correspond to substance and binding. Then the methane series, or the hydrocarbons, the non-functional compounds, all of our gasoline type stuff, is the principle of identity. And then we'll see that functional compounds represents the principle of combination. Those are things like alcohols, the various alcohols and so forth. And that polymers represent the principle of growth. They are chains that replicate, almost self-replicate. And then proteins, which are the principle of mobility, because with proteins, we have chains with side chains. And then finally, DNA and viruses. We'll get to viruses. That's a problem. But, okay, so let's go back to the beginning of the chapter and take a look at how the very elegant way that he lays this out. Okay, let's start with the metals. Okay, so here is his diagram for the metals. Metals are the first substage of the molecular kingdom. They represent the principle of potential because notice that the electrons just flow right on through metals. It has a freedom of mobility about it that corresponds to the kingdom of potential of light and the kingdom of potential for hydrogen, the hydrogen atom, and so forth. So it replicates that kind of potential. And each one of these has a different type of bonding. Metals have their own unique type of bonding. It's simply called metallic bonding. So that's the principle of potential with respect to this kingdom. So now let's take a look at salts. Salts then are the second substage, and they represent the principle of substance because now the electrons are being bound. They can't just flow through copper, let's say, and they have to deal with ionic bonds now. Let's say salt, ordinary table salt, which is NaCl, which is what the molecule he shows here. With ionic bonding, you have a positive charge. So you have two kinds of atoms. Let's say you take sodium, which has a positive charge, and chlorine, which has a negative charge, and they're bonded together because they're opposites. Opposites attract, as everyone knows. And so now the electrons, if you'll notice the diagram there on the right-hand side, are bonded. They have been captured, in other words. They can't go anywhere. So that's just the basic structure of table salt, which represents then the principle of binding, or substance, as he calls that, the second kingdom. So then let's move along to the methanes, or the hydrocarbons, as they're also called, or the paraffins, as they're also called. This is the third substage. It represents the principle of identity. These are non-functional compounds, and they're non-functional. They're non-functional in the sense that oil and water do not mix, and these are oils and gasoline, methane, ethane, propane, butane, pentane, hexane, which begins gasoline, and nonane, which begins kerosene. They're all highly flammable, but he says they represent the principle of identity because each one has a unique function. And the bonding now is covalent, so it's a different type of bonding that is holding them together. And he also says the benzene ring, that of course Kekule is famous for figuring out, belongs in this world. So that's the principle of identity. So let's move along here to the proteins then. Not the proteins, but let's see. We don't want the proteins yet. We want. Okay, so I don't have an image yet. Let's leave this image here. He doesn't give an image for the fourth substage, which is functional compounds, which represents the principle of combination. So we're at the bottom of the V-shaped arc for this realm, the molecular realm. Alcohols are an example. Alcohols, unlike oil and water, do mix. Alcohols are soluble in water. So we get wood alcohols, grain alcohols, propyl alcohol. We also get the aldehydes, such as formaldehyde, and the amines. So this principle at the fourth level represents compounds of compounds. And appropriately, the bonds are both ionic and covalent for this. And then at the fifth substage, he also doesn't give an image for the fifth substage, which are polymers, or non-functional polymers, which represent the principle of growth. And now the bonding is now covalent again. So it's as though we've gone to the bottom of the V-shaped arc, which we'll look at in a minute here. He plugs all these in a visual diagram. And then now it's going back up. This represents the principle of growth because polymers have the ability to almost sort of self-replicate. They're just chains. Cellulose, rubber, rayon, nylon. He says, while the structure of the polymer may seem monotonous because they're made up of chains, and here you can see proteins, which are chains with side chains. That's the diagram that we've been looking at here. The repeated links in the chain are the evolutionary jump which make possible greater wonders to come. Polymers resemble plants not only in producing a chain of cells, but in their capacity to grow. All chemicals from polymers on share this power. So then now here we are with proteins. This is the correct image for proteins, which is chains with side chains now. So we have polymers with side chains. So you can see that the molecular kingdom is getting more and more evolved and advanced as it goes along. This represents the sixth principle, that of mobility, which corresponds to the animal world. The bonding, once again, is back to ionic with proteins, and they are very complex. Actin and myosin are proteins that are necessary for moving the muscles of our bodies. There are structural proteins that include the keratins, skin, hair, fur, wool, horns, nails, claws, hoofs, etc. Enzymes, which are functional, insulin, amino acids, hemoglobin, and so forth. These are absolutely essential for building living things. And then, so that's 6. So this brings us now to the kingdom of dominion, which of course is DNA. So let's take a look at DNA here. Turn off the proteins, turn on DNA, and transition. Okay. Everybody knows what DNA looks like, but the thing about it to consider is that it has no symmetry, number one. It does not have radial symmetry. It does not have bilateral symmetry. It does not have complete symmetry. It is its own thing. It's a ladder, a helix. And it represents the principle of dominion in the realm of molecules because it tells everything else what to do. It's just pure information, and it sends out its slave messenger RNA into the cytoplasm of the cell to manufacture proteins. So it fits perfectly with this idea of a dominion. Now, okay, so he makes a mistake in lumping viruses in here, and he did inherit this model from another guy, a chemist. Viruses are alive. Sorry to have to inform you of that, but the entire scientific world thinks that they are not alive, and they are. They know how to reproduce. They are intelligent. And I knew this way, way back, but I recently confirmed it with a medium that viruses have souls. They're living things. So they don't belong here. They need, they almost need their own kingdom, like a sixth kingdom, to add to bacteria, because the way I see it, is that every time a new kingdom comes along, let's say with the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago, you get all these trilobites running around. And the trilobites are no bigger than they're like, you can hold them in the palm of your hand. They're like quarters, maybe, as are all these creatures, except for the Tyrannosaur, the monster, the 3-foot-long Anomalocaris, who's designed, look this creature up, who's designed specifically to gobble up trilobites. Now, I think when bacteria came into being, let's say 4 billion years ago, maybe 3.8, after the late heavy bombardment has brought water to the earth, you get the first bacteria. Those are souls coming in from the other side, little proto-souls, and viruses are the predators. So that's what they are. They're the predators. Every kingdom brings in herbivores, and if you have herbivores, you're going to have carnivores. We're at the top of the food chain because we eat both. Okay, so let's look at his arc then, how he plugs all this into his arc in a very brilliant and elegant way. So here's the arc. So level 1, let's go individually first. So we've got monatomic, which is monatomic. Those are the metals. Level 2, actually not level. This is the substage. These are the subs. Let's look at the substages first. Substage 1, metals. Substage 2, salts. Substage 3, non-functional compounds, which are the hydrocarbons. Substage 4 are the functional compounds, like alcohols and so forth. And then going back up the arc, substage 5 is non-functional polymers, such as rubber, rayon, nylon. And then substage 6, functional polymers, those are the proteins. And then finally, substage 7 with DNA. And now he says that, notice that on the right-hand column, the bonds hold the whole thing together, maybe with the exception of the first one, because metals have their own bonding. It's called metallic bonding. But he thinks that DNA may have a metallic bond somewhere at its core that might be superconductive and that may be found someday. Who knows? It sounds very iffy to me, but we'll forgive that. Then the next level down, at level 2 then, we have ionic bonding with both salts and proteins. They're both bound with that kind of bonding. Then at level 3, we have covalent bonding for both non-functional compounds, the methanes, and non-functional polymers, the chains. And then finally, with functional compounds at the bottom, level 4, with the alcohols and so forth, we have both ionic and covalent bonding. So the arc itself, as he sees it, recapitulates in miniature the whole. And as he says, this paragraph is worth reading actually, correspondences of substages to kingdoms. And he says, the conductivity of metals with their free-ranging electrons corresponds to electromagnetic radiation in the kingdom of light. 2. The binding of ionic compounds with their positively and negatively charged atoms corresponds to the proton and electron, the positive and negative particles. 3. The identity of the hydrocarbons in the paraffin series corresponds to atoms, which also form an alphabetical sequence with properties determined by their position therein. 4. The combinations, which we call functional compounds, are fourth substage because they are combinations of combinations. 5. The polymers in their self-replication and chains of units correspond to plant growth with its cell division. 6. The proteins, as the chemicals that move, correspond to the mobility of the animal kingdom. 7. DNA, which directs and governs the growth of plants and animals, gives us the clue to the distinctive character of the seventh kingdom. We can now call it the Dominion Kingdom. And then let's take a look at his little group. He gives these, each one its own little symbol here, which I kind of like. These are the symbols for each one of these kingdoms. So he's got, at the top here, he's got kingdom number 1, light. Its power is potential, and its image is a point. This kind of reminds me of Gene Gebser. He does something similar where he uses the point for the unity of the magical consciousness structure. Then 2 is nuclear. The power is binding, and he gives that a line, possibly because of the bilateral symmetry of it. 3 is atomic. The power is identity or form, and he gives it a circle because of radial symmetry, of course. 4 is molecular, which is the principle of either combination or separation, which is then 2 little circles. For plant, we have growth or organization, reproduction, and a chain. For 6, animal, we have mobility, chains with side chains. And then for 7, with man, dominion, we've got this little stick figure here. I'm not sure that he knew exactly what to put there. All right, so we're making some progress here. Let's take one more look at his overarching grid. Let's pull that up. Back again so we can see the look at the path that we're laying down and walking here, creating our own path as we go through this. So we're at the 4th level there, the molecular level, which is 0 degrees of freedom. Complete bondage and capture of light and, in this case, electrons. Complete symmetry. The combinations are molar, that is to say, molecular properties. This is the realm of classical physics, determinism. It's the only kingdom we can actually see. So here we are with, the molecules that make the vegetable and animal and human worlds visible. Everything from that point on is visible. So we've gone from metals as potential to salts as binding, to the methane series or the hydrocarbons as identity, to the functional compounds or the alcohols as combination, to polymers as growth, which are chains, and then with mobility we have proteins, chains with side chains, and then finally we have DNA. And I'm excluding viruses, sorry to say, but I do not agree with him on that or science. All right, that brings us back full circle here to the completion of this chapter, which is wonderful and elegant. Like I say, Young does not waste words. Every single sentence counts. It's very readable and worthwhile. So next we'll look at the plant kingdom.